the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Hello, everyone. I hope you had a good Easter. The fact that some are calling for President Trump to be certified unfit for office indicates the seriousness of the Iran crisis. His foul-mouthed and contradictory daily utterances are bad enough. But it's clear that the frustration is reaching dangerous proportions. It takes some incompetence to have us feeling a sneaking aberration for the cruel Iranian government as they refuse to surrender or collapse. At home, the start of April has seen millions benefit from the measures to ease the cost of living, pensions and universal credit up, two-child benefit cap gone. The big question is, will people give the government any credit for this in the run-up to the local elections? Well, the resident doctors certainly won't, as their bitter dispute with the government continues. And finally, on a slightly more optimistic note, will the Artemis moon mission make us reflect on the stupidity of destroying this blue haven in the black universe? There's a bit of poetry for my guests, who are Joe Phillips, former advisor, senior aide to Liberal Democrat leader Paddy Ashdown, and Martin Liptrot, Downtown's Director of Strategic Partnerships, who recently lived in America and has a good understanding of how Trump is playing with those all-important midterm voters. Joe, in the papers this morning, there is a picture on the White House balcony of Melania, the Donald, and an Easter bunny all looking outwards. And, you sort of think, who would you actually want to be leading the free world?
Give me the bunny. Give me the bunny anytime.
So what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, if somebody wrote last week, if this was your dad, it would be time to take away the car keys. Unfortunately, it's not a car he's driving. It's, the world to destruction. He is becoming increasingly unhinged. And just before we came on air, Martin and I were talking about who can actually stop him, which I'm sure Martin will shed some light on. But, he clearly and blatantly says he cares not a jot for international law. And his threats, whether or not they come to fruition, we'll see in the next few hours. But, the idea that you're bombing and deliberately destroying civilian infrastructure, it goes completely against the rules of engagement and the rules of war. And I think America is becoming increasingly isolated because A, nobody knows what the plan was in the first place. B, nobody knows how you get out of it. And C, what is being created is an absolute perfect storm of increased numbers of migrants desperately fleeing areas in the Middle East. Lebanon is now being razed to the ground very rapidly by Israeli forces. Gaza, while we're all looking the other way, is, as we know, absolutely flattened. Meanwhile, the settlers are going in and setting fire and taking hold of Palestinian residences and farms and things like that, all going on in plain sight. And we've still got Ukraine going on. So I think Trump he's caused chaos, and I, for one, would rather hear the bunny speak, or Melania.
Martin, two massive questions for you. Perhaps you could help us with the mechanics of removing a president. And then secondly, which I think I know the answer to, whether there's any remote possibility of it happening.
I'll start with the second one. You're right. There is a mechanism, but it isn't going to be utilised. So that's unfortunate for those who would like to see the president be impeached and deposed, but I don't think that's likely to happen, at least in the very short term.
But what about the incompetency route? I mean, that he's mentally unstable. That's the other one, isn't it?
That's a very long shot, and there's an awful lot of points of view and opinions on what is and what isn't. A failure to execute your duties, which is what it's really about. I think you're whistling in the wind if you think that's the route forward. The obvious route forward is the midterm elections. There is set of elections due, starting today. In fact, we have Marjorie Taylor Greene, if you remember her, stepped down from her seat in Congress, and the runoff is today. So we'll find out what happens there.
Is that whether she's going to be a candidate?
No. This is, she stood down from her seat, said she couldn't serve in Congress under the current administration, and the replacement for her is being decided today. They had what they called jungle elections, which is anybody from any party can stand, and I think 10 or 12 parties of all different colours and strengths stood, and it finished up with the two obvious parties, the Democrats, the Republicans, having, I think the Democrats are leading 37% of the vote, and the Republicans 30% of the vote. So they've got into the runoff, and that's what the election is today. I mean, to show you how the world changes and politics changes, the candidate who is the for the Dems in that seat is a retired military general and cattle farmer, which you would have imagined was, you know, the profile of the Republican, but that's the Democrat challenger. So we'll see whether they come through. But we get into the heavyweight elections in November, when both the Senate and the House will be, their fortunes will be decided. And to your question about, you know, what happens to the president, I think an active and engaged and forceful Congress is the right way forwards. At the moment, unfortunately, probably for a lot of political posturing purposes, you don't hear an awful lot from anybody of any significance within either the House or the Senate at the moment, and we need that back pronto.
But of course, Joe, there's a relatively long way to go until November, and decisions are imminent. I mean, we once again officially reach a crossroads tonight, and I'm cautious about this because Trump issues these ultimatums and then they seem to go away. But it looks as if tonight he's going to decide either that the peace talks have succeeded or that he's going to bomb the hell out of what's left of Iran. So what do you think is the immediate prospects?
Well, two things. I think regular listeners to this podcast will know very well that Frank and I, but Frank in particular, have long thought that the midterms will be cancelled if Trump thinks he's going to lose, and if he can find a way to say we're at war, it's too dangerous, we can't possibly do it, state of emergency. I mean, I think the other thing is, and this is something that has always perplexed me, in every other country in the world, you know who the opposition is, but in America you don't until they are selected to be the candidate for whichever party. And so it's very difficult from the outside to get a sense of a cohesive opposition. So we're only looking at the sort of crumbs, if you like. We're not really looking at what's happening on the ground because we're not there. And obviously Martin lived in America for a very long time, so has got a much more insight. I don't know. I mean, you can't tell. He's just as likely to say it's okay, they're begging for peace, they're begging for mercy. But what he's totally miscalculated is that the Iranians have absolutely no fear of death. They absolutely are not frightened by America. They loathe America. And he's made it 10 times worse for the Iranian people, those who wanted to overthrow the appalling regime. It's entrenched and emboldened the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. But of course, it is spreading so much wider across the Middle East. And, if you start bombing petrochemical sites, if you start doing what he threatened last week to bomb desalination plants, you actually make an awful lot of the Gulf states completely uninhabitable. So, what does he want to achieve? Because he hasn't achieved anything so far, other than to, well, as I say, embolden the regime. I mean, he may well do what they always say, Trump always chickens out, taco, walks away from it, claims some fictitious deal is on the table. Or, the other thing, and I really would be extremely concerned about this if I was involved in the security, that the Iranians launch an attack on America. Not on American troops, but on American soil. And that would be a huge...
Have they got the range? Have they got the range for that?
Well, they've probably got sleeper cells in the States already.
Oh, I see what you mean. An internal, yeah.
So I think, he really is literally playing with fire. And it's very difficult because there's nobody there. Although JD Vance is apparently heading off to have some sort of talk somewhere or other, and is known to be, or said to be, less enthusiastic about this war. And it may be that he's the person that can put the brakes on. But Hesketh won't, because he's absolutely reveling in it. For him, it's like a bloody porn show.
Martin, on the basis that Trump might walk away, that brings me to what the European powers and wider are doing, because the Foreign Secretary held a meeting very recently of 35 nations. And it seemed to me that their offer of help would come after a ceasefire. Now, Trump obviously decries that and says that's worse than useless. But I mean, where do you see the rest of the sort of the non-combatant nations and what role they might play if the fighting stops?
Well, the fighting stopping is probably not what's top of mind for everybody at the moment. Opening the Straits of Hormuz is what's top of mind for everybody, because particularly China and other emerging nations are heavily dependent on Iranian oils and gases for that. So I think that's where the negotiations are, the rebuilding, the restructuring, regime change, or whatever you may think follows in Iran. I don't think is even on the agenda at the moment. I think we're driven by an economic necessity at the moment, which is oil prices. And when you look at the domestic impact, we've now got, and I know it doesn't sound scary to the Brits, but we've now got $4 a gallon oil prices. There's a lot of angry Ford F-150 drivers out there now who find that unacceptable. So the president's polling is the lowest it's ever been. Only, Jim, you will know, only one president has been less popular than Trump is today. That was Harry Truman, but which is weird because he did loads of great things, but still was unpopular. But
he got re-elected.
Well, he did get re-elected and then slumped. Yeah, I think career was an issue, wasn't it? But Trump's polling is as low as it's ever been. It's below Biden's, which is probably the kind of benchmark that he's most frequently measured against, and it's not looking healthy in any of the what we call swing states or the key states in the midterm. So there's a lot of pressure internally from the Republican Party to save their own skins and to bolster that. He's driven by headlines, as you know. It's not we're having a conversation about politics as normal and world affairs as normal. They're not even in the game, unfortunately. This is about one man and his personality cult and his search for headlines and to be the news, to make the news. The dramatic rescue of the pilot over the weekend was spectacular. Another sign of the capability and capacity for the American security forces from FBI, CIA, and the special teams units themselves. That's something that he will, say was his doing. So there's going to be a lot of conversation about what are the real pressure points, and the pressure points I see are global pressure on the need to get oil and gas prices back under control, and secondly, the impact that's having on the domestic electoral fortunes of incumbent Republicans, particularly.
But are any of them? Is there any sign of any senior ones of them actually breaking with Trump, because he continues to have this sort of almost terrorizes the Republican Party with primary threats and so on? He's done that throughout the last 10 years. Is there any sign of anybody actually saying to hell with that, I've got to save my own skin, and actually trying to distance themselves publicly from the president?
Yeah, there are conversations. I mean, as I said earlier, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is, MAGA through and through, she's of that wing of the party, stepped down. Now, it's probably a tactical move so she doesn't lose her seat, and secondly, allows her to start raising money for her candidacy for the ticket in the next election. But she's a big beast, and she stepped down. There are definitely old Republican voices. Let's talk about the Bushes and that kind of wing of the party, who are frequently commentating on how dissatisfied they are with the administration's performance. And there are individual skin-saving operations in all states, senates, and congressional districts to do the same. But the balance is, will you still be on the ticket if you start running the president down? Will your local party members, because remember we have this weird system whereby you have to be a registered voter. So currently there's, I think, 28% of all voters are registered as Democrats and 23% are registered as Republicans. The first time it's switched for a long while. But 43% or something along those lines are registered as independents, which means there's floating voters, swing voters, and who are they listening to? Joe's point earlier, spot on. We don't have a system, a parliamentary system. There isn't an opposition party. We have a Congress, and that's the bit that's silent at the moment, unfortunately. And we need to hear more voices from those elected officials, on these matters of state that are being challenged at the moment.
I want to come back to Joe in a moment to move on to the domestic front, but just finally, because Frank does go on about the cancellation of the midterm elections because we're in a state of war. Do you give that any credence at all?
It's a possibility, isn't it? Because it can be, if we're at war, it can be an executive order. I think that there's going to be an enormous kickback if America's elections are cancelled. There's an awful lot of money already being spent and an awful lot of money betting on what the outcomes are. We have wonderful things in the US that you're not allowed to do in the UK, which is gamble furiously on the outcomes of these things, and that money's not going to be diverted. I think the likelihood is that the elections will go ahead, but you will see significant movement in the positioning of various wannabe elected officials, those on the tickets, away from the administration and trying to find the safe ground within the Republican mainstream again.
I think just another point is the MAGA group, the MAGA family, if you like, is now apparently quite fractured. So you've got people like Tucker Carlson, and these people who have huge influence, much more, the sort of social media and the podcasts and things, perhaps, than the sort of traditional, what they call legacy media, which Trump has largely destroyed, apart from the New York Times. But you're really seeing criticism from those sort of people who were fervent Trump backers, particularly over the war. So I think, that has something to play for in public opinion.
There's been a swing. So where I live in the US, I live in North Florida, so it's a tourism place largely, but it's also the home to 3 significant strategic Air Force bases. So big defense, if you want to call it that sector, is present there. We've also got a lot of retirees, military retirees, and wealthy retirees who have holiday homes there. It's a deep red block of the country, red being the Republicans in the US color schemes. January 6th last year, or year before, when he was, or last year in fact, when he was inaugurated, lots of Trump stickers, lots of Trump flags, lots of Trump T-shirts and hats on the beaches and up and down the main roads. This January just gone, 1 year in, nowhere near as visible. So I think that MAGA base is fracturing. I think some of the behaviours and some of the moves have diminished people's passions for that. Some of the appointments. You saw, Kristi Noem lose her job just recently. Pam Bondi's lost her job just recently. Hegseth doesn't look particularly safe where he is if all this goes upside down. So I think there's a lot of chaos at the moment in that kind of purist, fundamentalist MAGA base, and it's looking for a home. It's looking for a leader. It's looking for a spokesperson. I think it's going to drift back towards the mainstream Republican movement over the next year and a half. Right.
Can we sort of switch to domestic affairs now? there's been a drumbeat of criticism that the Labour government over its 2 years nearly in office now has never had a theme, and people don't know what it stands for. But to try and be fair, this week we've had a raft of measures which are the responsibility of the government, in increasing pensions and doing away with the two-child benefit, increasing universal benefit. So there will be a lot of people this week who will be better off, will be more able to cope with the cost of living crisis. And I want to sort of ask you both whether this is going to make any difference in the local elections and beyond. Are people going to say, oh, well, hang on, for all the noise and for all the mistakes, this is the beginnings of the effect of a Labour government coming in? Or have things sort of, as they do sometimes in politics, nobody's listening? So, Joe, do you want to start us off on that?
Well, yes, I mean, it's great news for people on pensions and benefits and people with more than 2 children. And there are perfectly valid reasons for doing all of those things, which you would expect a Labour government to do. But, the flip side of that coin is the working people that the government is so often talking about are going to think, hang on a minute, I've got an increase in my council tax, my water rates, everything else, cost of fuel, general cost of living. I'm not seeing any increase, but these people, many of whom are working and many of them are getting universal credit because they're on such low wages. But there will be a bit of a lashback, I think, of people thinking, well, hang on, why am I working when these people, pensions particularly, are not doing anything and everything's getting tighter? So, I mean, to be honest, at the moment, I don't think the local elections are at the forefront of anyone's minds, except perhaps for, the people in political parties. But we'll see what happens by the time we get, in a month's time.
Too much emphasis on welfare and not enough on economic growth and helping entrepreneurs, Martin?
As always. I think Joe's points are interesting, aren't they? Because that these local elections are being seen and being interpreted as a kind of, referendum on Starmer's performance to date, and that's what we're reading. The emergence of the Greens and the Reform Party, both on the extreme wings of the political spectrum, their fortunes are being, read and interpreted. And I don't think anybody's talking about these elections in the sense of value for money from your council tax and what's the future of adult social care and all the issues that are actually local government related. There's probably an argument, isn't there, that we need a new system for local administration, and having reams and reams and reams of politically appointed councillors might not be the best solution at the moment. So there's a secondary conversation to be had about if this doesn't work, if every year 4.99% on your council tax for slightly worse surfaces is no longer acceptable to most of us living in the nation, you have to ask what could or would replace that system. And we're not having that conversation. I think the devolution...
Except there is local government reorganisation going on to remove
that's what I was going to say.
duty.
The devolution debate could be the catalyst for that, couldn't it? We could utilise that and say, actually, if we had funding and fiscal powers regionally, and we started to look more like some of the parts. I mean, back in the US, it's the United States of America. The state supremacy is the word. Could we have something similar here? Is there an opportunity for the north of England or the northwest of England to have some kind of authority control that makes these big decisions? The government's latest plan, I think, is to take funding for social care and children's care and special needs back central again, because they're not seeing value for money in the way that it's currently being invested. So I think there's a bigger debate about what does local authority administration do and how do we want to see it accountable.
But go on. I'm sorry, go on.
Well, I mean, we all care about it, and I am passionate about local government because I think, you know, and I expect you might agree, Jim, local government touches people's lives in a way that central government very often doesn't. And I think, you know, if you could engage people in having that conversation and say, look, if you had, I mean, I'm speaking to you from Kent. Well, you know, it's a huge country. County rather, with a 10-year difference in life expectancy from one side to the other. You know, and you've got all sorts of issues about transport, employment, lack of schools, too much house building without any infrastructure, water shortages, which keep making the news, and so on and so forth. So I do think there is an argument, but it's up to government and people like us, if you like, people within the political sphere, to actually say, look, let's get involved, because the other thing about local elections is the turnout is unbelievably low. So, you know, the Reform might get their vote out, the Greens might get their vote out, but, you know, most people will just go, oh, what's the point? You know, it's the same thing. And local government doesn't have any power, which is what your point, Martin. And I think if you could say to people, if your local authority had more power, and devolution, where we've seen it work in Manchester, for instance, or the West Midlands, well, you know, then I think people would engage much more.
But the government are talking about actually giving a chunk of
but
money
they need
for
to do more
local
than
determination. Talk. Yeah.
And the trouble
well,
is,
you know
Jim,
what it is. The Treasury will always
I know,
try and
but
pull
what
that back.
they did, you know, instead of selling it as a really good thing, it became a story about cancelling elections. You know, and it's another example of the government being on the back foot with a good idea that was then hijacked. It's a bit like, you know, Sadiq Khan's war on motorists for ULEZ schemes. Actually, it wasn't a war on motorists, it was a public health issue, and it's about air quality. It's not about driving cars. But, you know, they allow these things to go, and it's, oh, yeah, you know, the elections are being cancelled, all in the name of democracy. And the government didn't have what Tony Blair's government had with Alistair Campbell, was a rebuttal unit to say, no, actually, this is about making local government more accountable.
Right. So going back to my original point, it seems, Martin, that Joe doesn't think that anything that's happened this week with these benefits is going to cut through, that the government is still weighted down by all the mistakes and so on. Is that your view?
You've also got to look at where are the votes actually taking place. Most of the metros aren't up. So perhaps where Labour voters are clustered in the largest numbers and in greatest depth, we're not going to have those elections taking place as widely as we are out in the rurals and suburbans. Do those issues cut through and impact as much in, I don't know, rural Kent as they would in downtown Liverpool or Manchester?
Well,
probably not.
We haven't got elections either. So, I mean, you know, interestingly, and that's a really good point, London will be seen as a bellwether where I suspect the Greens will take seats from Labour and possibly take control of Labour councils. But there's an awful lot of places in the country where the votes aren't even happening.
One thing on the other side, you know, in terms of, you know, not sort of leaning towards welfare and all that sort of stuff, is the doctors' dispute. And we've seen quite a tough, we've always heard tough rhetoric from Wes Streeting, but that was brought into actual tangible results last week, where 1,000 doctors' places have been removed from the deal, and there seems to be no sign of a resolution on this. I do get the impression that the public opinion is not with the doctors, and that one of their weakest points is that they've not put out government's offer to a ballot. Martin, do you want to start us off on the doctors?
I think people are sympathetic to the doctors. I think they're not sympathetic to the BMA. BMA's behaving like, you know, we used to remember union leaders of old, you know, where the members don't need to be involved in this. This is for me and the committee. I thought we'd left those days behind, but the BMA, with its kind of white collar professional trade unionism, perhaps doesn't want to give that ground up. It's got to go to a ballot. Look, they've been offered 35% more than they were earning 4 years ago, and there's a whole load of investment going into fast tracking trained doctors into medical positions in trusts around the country. There's complications in how that happens and how quickly it happens, but you've got to get the ballot of the, what are they called, resident doctors now, not junior doctors. Resident doctors need to vote on this. This can't just be the Secretary of State for Health and the leader of the BMA having a Radio 4 chin wag every morning. We're all bored of that. Let's get over ourselves and let the members have a vote.
I mean, there are other issues, to be fair to the doctors, about where they work. They don't know where they're going to be working, and they're moved around. And
a friend of mine's got 2 lads just come out of Nottingham, trained medical school out of Nottingham, taken at places in Bath and Bristol. Didn't know they were going there, but they've gone there because that's where the opportunities exist. The offer was to increase another 1,000 of those training places. Which would have given perhaps more people more options nearer to where they wanted to be or thought they needed to be. But let's be honest, these are 21, 22-year-old trained medics. They can probably up sticks and move their lives from wherever they went to university to wherever the jobs are. It's not a huge sacrifice, is it?
Just on the removal of these 1,000 doctors' places, I mean, if we, which I think we do, we need more doctors. Isn't the government, in one sense, shooting itself in the foot?
Well, yes. I mean, I thought it was a bonkers thing to say. Either we need 1,000 extra doctors or we don't. And if we do, and we want homegrown doctors rather than importing foreign doctors, and thus denying homegrown doctors access to those places, well, you keep that offer on the table. I mean, the thing is, I think Martin's absolutely right. If this was the train drivers, there'd be absolute fury that it was just worked out between the union leader and the Secretary of State. And I think the BMA have behaved appallingly. But if you look at the cost over the last 3 years, the Times has done analysis this morning, £3 billion the doctors' strikes have cost, £50 million a day to the NHS. That is the equivalent of 75,000 nurses, new nurses for a year, 1,000 MRI scanners and 3 brand new hospitals. They got a 28.9% increase within weeks of this government being elected. They now want a further 26%. Plus all these other things about training. It's just unsustainable. And I don't think there is any public sympathy. And I think, there are a whole load of questions about why consultants or locums are being able to charge, £300-400 an hour to cover the junior doctors. There's a whole big issue about how the NHS uses agency and locum staff to cover vacancies and cover shortages. But it does seem as though the government and the doctors are shooting themselves in the foot, and the people who are suffering are the rest of the people, not just the patients, but the other people who work in the health service, the paramedics, the radiographers, the nurses, the porters, the people who are doing outpatient surgeries. It's just, it's ridiculous. And I don't think there's anybody in this country that wouldn't say, yes, of course, I'd like to go back when my wages were worth more. But it's a fool's argument. It's childish.
Well, of course, ultimately, I mean, obviously, Wes Streeting has a major say in how this dispute is being conducted. But in the background always is the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, who we need to take a sort of weather check on her position at the moment and what she's looking at with the British economy, because it was pretty tight before the Iran war. Some of the effects are still a bit further down the pipeline. But Martin, looking out at the moment in terms of business opinion, which Downtown's always in touch with, what's the feeling about things at the moment?
Not quite pessimistic, but definitely down in the mouth. I think at an SME level, I think some of the initiatives that have been introduced, particularly around minimum wage for young people, rates issues, changes in national insurance, I think are give the impression that the dialogue hasn't been rich enough, and that the government hasn't been listening to those reasonable voices from the business community. I think the challenge with where we are with oil prices is undoubtedly they're inflationary. I journeyed through North Wales on Easter Monday yesterday and saw petrol being advertised at £1.69 a litre, which brings back the old saying of, when beer's cheaper than fuel, drink, don't drive. But there's definitely going to be an inflationary impact of that. So we're all braced for that. We're all going to be a bit short in the pocket for the next few months, perhaps, whilst it stabilises, hopefully. The challenge is that a growth hazard as well? Is that something that's going to stymie growth and make businesses, SMEs particularly, not take on an extra person, not invest in a second outlet, not invest in new mechanisms and equipment for their factories and sites? And that's a bigger risk, isn't it? That if growth is already fragile, we don't want to see these externalities stymie it even further.
What about the always prosperous southeast of England, Joe? What people feeling about the immediate economic prospects?
I mean, it's a myth that it's prosperous in terms of, house prices for sure. But there is no industry here. Farming's been decimated. The cost of travel across the county, most people commute to London, but we've got no major hubs. Retail has gone through the floor, as it has in so many places. And so, apart from the ordinary, and as Martin says, it's the SMEs and the smaller businesses, it's the hairdressers, it's the bakers, it's the pubs, it's the restaurants. I mean, I live in a seaside town where Easter is the beginning of the season, where it's a sort of make or break time, but they can't afford to take people on, and they can't afford to take on young people. And so those young people are not getting the experience that they need, which means that there's another, barrier to them getting into work. And again, it goes back to this thing about benefits. We are so unequal in this country, and it's not for the want of the Labour government trying to balance out the inequality between rich and poor, but we've now got a huge inequality between young people and older people. And if young people cannot afford to get a house, if they can't even get a Saturday job or an evening job. I had my two younger grandchildren here yesterday. Now, one of them is starting work today, in fact, in an ice cream shop, and the other one's working in the stables, which is fine. But that's because they can go and ask somebody in a small place. You can say, have you got a job? But you can't even get a job in Sainsbury's or Tesco's without applying online. And then you don't hear back. And then, the chances are somebody older will get that job anyway. So it's really, really hard for kids to get any work experience. That makes them become harder to employ, harder for employers to take a gamble because of the increase in the minimum wage and the workers' rights and things. Meanwhile, pensions are going up. So where would young people possibly feel there's a future?
So can we expect the courageous speech from Ed Davey soon telling us the hard truth that the triple lock has got to be broken?
Well, I'd like to see that, because I think it should have been said a long time ago. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Reform have come out and changed their tune and said, yes, we want to keep it. It's unsustainable, Jim. And, we actually need to have a conversation about young people and their future. People of our sort of age have had it easy. We had free university. We had access to jobs. We could flip and switch jobs if we didn't like that one, whether it's a part-time job or something else. We were able to get onto, the property ladder through renting and buying our own home. So we are very fortunate, but we are dependent on young people working in order to pay taxes, to pay for the things that we might need later, whether that's a health service or defence. And, this is why the Greens are absolutely cleaning up with young people, because they're offering hope to young people. I mean, most of it is utterly bonkers, but, they are appealing to young people. And I agree with you, the Liberal Democrats, they're fine, they're good, they're solid, they're reliable, they do a really good job as local council, but they need to come out and say something bold, and not just we need to rejoin Europe. Everybody knows that.
Martin, on that point about Reform's stance, don't end the triple lock. It's a fascinating thing for a person of your experience of political strategy for political parties, because on the one hand, we know why they're doing that, because an awful lot of their supporters benefit from the triple lock. But on the other hand, they want to pose as a radical party, telling the truth, giving the awkward questions a rinse down. And yet, with that behavior, they're just like the rest. It's an interesting political calculation they made on that, isn't it?
Yeah, look, young people like me and others who we look at you boomers and we think, God, you had it easy. Well, you had it easy.
I hope there's going to be some AI generated,
I noticed a few grey hairs there on Martin's head.
It's sun-kissed blonde. I told you I was in North Wales at the weekend.
Jim, at least he's got hairs.
Yeah. Harsh. No, look, I think there's definitely, pragmatism even in reform, right? So they realise that if they're going to get anywhere in terms of numbers of votes, it's going to be because lots of old people rock up and vote for them, reminiscing about how good things were, with outside lavatories and rickets. So that's the electoral strategy for them. So of course they're going to say things that are favourable to that community. The reality is both the Greens and Reform know that neither of them are going to form an administration and have to make any real hard decisions. In fact, where Reform have in county council elections, they've failed miserably, and they probably don't want to repeat that again. I think what both of them would like at the next general election is enough seats to get some government money to operate as an opposition style party, and for Farage, for example, to be able to give out some shadow positions so we could hold people's feet to the fire a little bit more, run the party more professionally. But the key point you make is spot on. The politicians, unsurprisingly, are influenced by what people who vote think and do. And whilst we can suggest that we need a recalibration of that, when young people's turnout at polls is dramatically lower than old people's turnout at polls, that's not political expedience from those of us who've worked in the operations side of politics before.
Right. Well, let's finish off on the moon, and I'm sure we were all. Well, I certainly was. I was literally clutching my chair when the takeoff took place, because the pictures I was seeing was just masses of flame and smoke. And, well, we know about Challenger and stuff like that. I just wasn't sure what I was looking at, but I'm just so full of admiration for these courageous people going around the moon. It is interesting, Joe, that in their transmissions to Earth, there is a bit of a theme that look at that lovely, beautiful blue dot in a black sky, and can't we do better on Earth? It is a sort of, for astronauts who are professional, astronauts, it's interesting the political tinge they're trying to give to it. And the second question is, will anyone take any notice?
Well, isn't it? It is interesting that it happened over Easter weekend. You've got the new Archbishop of Canterbury, you've got Pope Leo in the Vatican, you've got other religious leaders around the world calling for an end to this madness, and you've got people who are further away from Earth than any human's ever been, and saying exactly as you say. And I have to say that, space stuff usually leaves me pretty cold. And, I think it's amazing. I think it's a fantastic achievement. But isn't there something so tragic about the irony of a country that is able to do something as amazing as this, with all the billions and all the brain power and all the science and everything else to make this even possible, while they're looking from up there down at us here, destroying our planet? And most of that destruction is coming from America.
Martin?
Easter is interesting, but it's also perhaps the ultimate Passover. With what's good about it is that this shows the capability of man, and that when we collaborate, because it's not just an American effort, it's a multi-market effort, good things can happen. Personally, I would be petrified of being one of those astronauts strapping yourself onto, 8 how many was it, gigamillions or whatever of fuel that they used, which when we've got a shortage in the Straits of Hormuz seems a little bit flagrant. But off they went, and good for them. And I'm sure that the experiments that they're conducting, we know nothing about them, will impact and be beneficial in the future, hopefully for good, as much as for the defence initiatives that will be being investigated at the same time. I personally think that seeing those pictures of Earth, human-generated pictures, because they were photographs effectively, I think it does make us all stop and think, and that in and of itself perhaps is the best that can come out of that at the moment.
Right, well, thank you both very much indeed, and we'll be back again next week, hopefully with Frank in charge, but for now, goodbye.